Here with me today, I have Dr. Áine O'Dea. She is an occupational therapist, a coach, and founder of Radiance Consulting. Her work sits at the intersection of neuroscience, neurodiversity, and real-world work demands. She helps organizations reduce burnout, remove invisible barriers, and supports high performance by understanding how different people think and their work styles work best. And I am so excited to have you join us, Áine. Thank you for being here.
You're so welcome. It is my pleasure. Thank you.
And I'm so excited to talk about this topic because it's something that is personal to me. I have a number of family members who have ADHD, have neurodivergence. I've worked with people who are neurodivergent, both people who've managed me, people who I've managed in my coaching experience, both as a coach in the work world, but as in a coach in sports. I've felt it. And I feel like there's been a lot of strides to lessen the stigma and the stereotypes, but I think there's still a lot of work to do. And a lot of leaders want more information, they want more guidance, but they don't know where to go and don't know where to turn. So I am really hoping in our conversation today, we're going to give leaders some more guidance and tools to be able to create a really inclusive work environment where you're, like you said, like what you do, you avoid burnout and you help teams reach peak performance.
Absolutely. Let's jump in.
Let's get in. So I always like to level set. What does neurodivergence mean? Maybe if you can give us some definitions, Áine.
So, neurodivergence means that when you think of neuro means that we're thinking about the brain, okay, that neurological system. And divergence mean something diverges. So, when you think about the brain, we have our neurological, our neurosystem. And for some people, it diverges from what we think is the neurotypical. So for years, we all went around thinking that the majority neurotype was neurotypical. And now, in the last number of years, that's really shifting because we're like, well, what is neurotypical? What exact, and how do we, am I really neurotypical? So neurodivergence really means where there's divergency there from what was deemed to be the majority neurotype. There's another word that you might often hear then as well, which is neurodiversity. And it can be really difficult for managers because they're like, which word should I use? And they don't want to get the words wrong. So neurodiversity means that on average in an organization, you will have a neurodiverse population in your workforce, in your team, in your company, because that means that you have different neurotypes. You have some people who are neurotypical, you have some people who are neurodivergent. And when you put them all together, you now have diversity. You have a neurodiverse workforce. So we can jump into more about like neurodivergency, but they're the overarching definitions really.
And so it's not just a diagnosis. Like when I think of neurodivergence, I think of ADHD or depression or some of those invisible illnesses or diagnoses. We're not talking about just diagnoses, that includes that, but anybody who,
Exactly.
all the different ways that we think.
Absolutely. And that is because some people will have a diagnosis, some people will never have a diagnosis and will never want it. But you're right. So it's that natural variation in the population around actually these different thinking styles, different traits, different characteristics. Because even when you said there the words like ADHD, depression, they all present slightly differently. But sometimes if we think of it more of like, we're going to work with populations that are neurospiky as a manager. And as a manager, you're never going to want to label somebody immediately and say, Lindsay, I noticed that you communicate like this. Are you an ADHDer? Are
Right.
you an autistic person? So we want to understand, and when managers understand more about neurodivergency, more about not that they need to learn the areas of the brain, but more about thinking about brain skills, brain thinking styles and patterns. Now they know how to engage with that employee because every employee is different. So they know how to map their leadership style to the person in front of them. And not that they have to have 10 styles, but it's just how they can engage with that person. And we all do that on a day-to-day basis.
Exactly. So, in we don't want to, you're right, as a manager, diagnose or label or put terms, but how might you as a manager see neurodivergence show up in the workplace? So show up in the work, in behaviors. How does it
Okay.
display?
So it might display, when we think about that variation, so you might have variation in social communication styles, how somebody interacts in their social communication and in their engagement. So that's one way, okay? Some people might be very direct. Some people might be very, maybe they're a little bit more long winded. Maybe they need to kind of like know all of the context around something before they can make a decision or move on. And often we think about social communication as a characteristic within an autistic profile. So that's one of the ways that we might notice is our social communication. Other ways that a manager might notice it is with regard to our what we call our executive functioning skills, our cognitive skills. So how we plan, organize, manage our time, how we start things, how we problem solve them. So our approach to it. They're all skills, and we classify them as executive functioning skills that we often notice fall under a profile maybe of somebody who may have a diagnosis of ADHD. And they may find some of those areas difficult, and we might notice that, well, why are they disorganized or chaotic or late for meetings? We might notice things as a manager, notice that I'm giving you as the example now, Lindsay, but in a team meeting that, Lindsay didn't actually take very good notes. Why didn't she take better notes? And it might be maybe there's a piece there of that you're dyslexic. I say that because I'm dyslexic. So that's the piece of we often notice for people in the workplace. Dyslexia isn't about being able to read. It's actually about information processing. So it might be the piece that more I can't actually listen, really engage with the meeting, and take the notes at the same time because that takes up a lot of working memory. It might be that maybe you might notice it in things like your emailing or communication style across that way. So when we think about neurodivergency, we want to support managers to understand the various profiles like autistic, ADHD, dyslexic, dyspraxic, OCD, Tourette's, so that they've got an awareness and understanding of them, and then that they know what characteristics they might observe, because they may observe some in people who have a formal diagnosis, but they may also observe it in many people who haven't gone down the route of formal diagnosis.
Mm. And how do you separate, when you say some of those things like showing up late to a meeting, not taking meeting notes, it's hard to separate what is performance related and it is the performance is lacking because there is maybe a disconnect or some, how do you manage that in relation to performance?
That is a brilliant point, because that's the first point that we as managers want to lean into. We want to put in the supports, the adaptations, the environmental tweaks so that we can see if we can get the most out of our employees. It costs too much to let them go because then we have to invest in recruitment and we have to re-uptake and reskill and all of that. So we want to look at it first of all. Well, what about if I made simple tweaks in the environment, like really simple environmental things? So many teams will already do things like this. They might use project management systems, maybe like Trello or Asana or another program, that's an organizational skills tool. That is what we would call, in my world of the neuroscience, that's a visual cognitive strategy. But yet you don't think about that if you're an engineer or you're in the hospitality industry, that we're using visual cognitive strategies. You're like, well, this is just the project management tool. So we want to put in the things that will help to support organizational skills, time management, planning, problem solve, awareness of different communication styles, and asking people in meetings, how do you like feedback? What works best for you? Would you like the agenda beforehand? Do you need to know all of the information about this project, or can we just dive straight in? So you put in those pieces first, and then what you notice is that helps everybody, not just the neurodivergent people. And that should enhance performance and then well-being, because people feel better about their job and productivity. If it doesn't address it, yes, you can then go back to the employee and have that open conversation about, look, we've put these supports in for everybody. I notice that you're still struggling with this. I see that project wasn't finished. We can name the area of challenge, and then we can identify, is it a performance issue, or do we need further tweaks and adaptations? If it's a performance issue, we can now stand over it ethically and recognise that, well, actually, I've done the things that I needed to do. And that might be over like 2-3 meetings. What the research, both in industry and the academic literature, tells us that most reasonable accommodations for neurodivergent employees are low cost. So we know that actually they come back down to things like how my manager engages with me, check-ins, simple adaptations in the workplace.
I often think of, someone who comes into work with a broken arm, right? You see the cast and you are able to make clear work accommodations. So, do we need voice dictation? Do we need an ergonomic setup to support you? But when it's not as visible, I think it's a little bit more challenging. Now, what's your take on the invisible versus the visible? And that also contributes to some of the stigma, right? It's easier to support somebody visibly versus the invisible.
Yeah, absolutely. If we go back to that definition to start, the natural variation in brain skills and thinking styles and traits, right? Then it means that actually, if everybody has that language in a company or in an organization or in a team, that, and I mean a team on the pitch or off the pitch in an office, and we say, how do you work best, Lindsay? What actually helps you best in work? Do you find Teams meetings like really efficient and effective? Or do you find email better? What actually is your preferred communication piece that will help you in this job? And then rather than having to, because diagnoses don't actually tell you a lot. That's like telling you I've blonde hair, but you're this, how many shades of blonde hair? That doesn't say that, oh, you need to treat it this way or that way. So you want to find out from the employee. You want to say to them, okay, in this job, like say if you work in hospitality, it's fast paced, it's a really quick decision-making industry, no matter what end of hospitality you're in. You want to say things like, okay, we need to be highly organized. We have to do a lot of problem solving, planning. How do you approach that? What things help you? Where do you notice that you will get caught in your role? Are you the person, do you love being front of house? Or do you notice that you're better on operations? So actually we want to ask better questions, because if we ask better questions, that now tells us how we're going to help the person to perform better and be more productive. And that really is the value in providing training for HR leaders, managers around what do we mean by neurodiversity in the workplace. That really, I think, is the biggest benefit to companies that it changes how everybody interacts.
It makes you more empathetic, more understanding. And I love the idea of asking questions. And you can do that with anybody regardless, so that you can adjust your behavior, your approach, your style to however someone works best.
Absolutely. I was recently involved in a project with somebody, and at the time, I didn't know they identified as being ADHD, and they have it. And she asked me, and she said, what's your style of prepping for projects? And we had a very open discussion. And then she said to me at the end of it, she said, okay, because she said, I have to plan, she said. And she said, I'm saying this now that she said, I won't deviate on these planning meetings because they keep me on track, she said. Otherwise, I will show up and I will not stay on track and we won't get this done. And I need to get this finished on time. So she was really aware of how her neurodivergency can impact her, but she was also really aware of how to play to her strengths. So as managers, if we know how to play to our strengths and we can support people to do that, they know how to ask better curious questions and how to give better feedback as well when they are noticing things that look like performance.
If you do identify, if you do understand, if you do have or even if you don't have a diagnosis, maybe you've self-diagnosed or realized that you might think or approach things differently. What are your thoughts on, both from a leader, from a manager, from a frontline, in sharing your work style or a diagnosis?
I think it's a tricky one because I think as if we take the frontline worker first, we have to be realistic and think often it will be difficult for them because they don't know what the company response will be or the manager response. So what's really helpful in that scenario is if the employee has insight and awareness into what their strengths are, so that they can actually walk in and say, I work really well when I know the schedule beforehand. I like to have the notes before the meeting and the agenda so that I can have reviewed them. I always use AI captions on online meetings so that I can check in afterwards and make sure we follow up on actions. But that puts a lot of onus on the employee. And some employees will, some employees won't have that level maybe. As a HR leader or a senior leader, I think if they have awareness around what neurodiversity in the workplace looks like, that's incredible because they do have the power and they can really change it. So even things like being able to open up in team meetings and say things of like, to normalize it and validate it, like, oh my gosh, there's such an awful smell in here today. Like, what is coming from outside? I actually can't think. So we can actually bring this piece into the workplace of like, what is the impact of sensory sensitivity, of smell, of noise? We know that sound in the workplace is one of the biggest sensory dysregulation stimuli. So we can actually talk about going, yeah, the good old phrase of, I can't hear myself think. And as the leader, I can actually say, you know what? I'm dyslexic, I'm autistic, I'm ADHD. I don't have a diagnosis, but I know that I am really triggered by that. Actually, can we look at this? Because you know what? That's not good for any of us. So, definitely as leaders, if a leader can bring that conversation to their team, it does, because it now gives the team the message, it is okay to be myself here. Actually, my manager will meet me empathically and we can discuss and have an open, honest conversation about what support will look like.
And so, even as a leader, let's say if you don't identify as neurodivergent,
Yep.
how do you create that environment where people feel safe?
Even if you don't identify as it, we know that the research tells us that 1 in 7 people are neurodivergent. And that makes sense because there's such difference across our workforces. So then it is the piece around actually coming with curiosity and thinking, I know in my team of 14 people that they're going to have different styles of thinking. And if I want them to do what I need to be done, I need to make sure I communicate that in a way that everybody can hear it. So rather than thinking about putting the onus back on, if we stand back and think about, okay, I might need to do two pieces. For some people, they might need very direct, clear communication. For some, they might need more softer, compartmentalized. But for the leader, really, it's that piece of their awareness and understanding of what neurodivergency looks like so that they can communicate in the most effective and efficient ways. And in ways, we've been doing that a lot in leadership for years. We've been looking at intergenerational communication. We've been looking at diverse workforces. This is just the next evolution of making sure that we're supporting everybody to work and perform efficiently and productively and stay well.
So, is there anything that you've seen leaders do with good intention? So they're well-meaning, but it doesn't have the intended impact as it relates to neurodivergence.
Often the first things that I've noticed that are unintentional consequences is often around language of in both ways. I'm going to give both examples here because I've seen it at both sides of a leader saying, you're so autistic, you're so rigid.
Or you're so
And it's like,
OCD. You hear that all the time.
yeah, you're so silly, and immediately then the person, what that says to the other person is, you need to hide or mask that behavior because that's not the behavior that we really like in this organization. So language is often, or on the flip side, I hear people say, oh, you can't be autistic, you don't look it. Really? You're not ADHD, you're not disorganized. How can you be dyslexic? You have a PhD. So it can go both ways. So language is often the first piece. The other piece that I notice where it's unintended is where people put in supports without actually, in a way, doing a survey, auditing, talking to their team and asking them, what do you think? Do you think we need these? Are these the best ones? How would you see this working? So that like blanket approach, one size fits all. Or where they think, oh, we did training in neurodiversity, we know this, that's done. And it was a 30-minute webinar. So maybe just to think, it's like anything, it evolves, it changes. So they're probably the biggest pieces that I notice.
And we've talked a lot about, accommodations, which can sometimes feel negative. But I've seen, again, with family members with ADHD or other that there are such gifts, there are such strengths, there are such amazing qualities that come from that different way of thinking. What are some of the maybe strengths that you've seen from neurodivergence, and how do employers not just accommodate to fit into the norm, but how do they really leverage those strengths for their teams?
That's brilliant. As an employer and as a recruiter, you absolutely want to think that you want to be bringing those people in. Because if you don't, you're not going to have diversity of thought. And what will that bring? Stagnation, boredom, groupthink, all of the things that we know that will never help with innovation, creativity, and entrepreneurship in a business. So you want to be thinking about, if we get everybody and we recruit people that all look like me, it's not a good long-term strategy for any organization. So you want to recruit people that will think in different ways because they will challenge. They'll say, why do we do it this way? They will look at things. So like your person who's really analytical and who's got that real focused mindset of being so thorough and quite, in-depth in their style, they're your asset because now you have the person who does the audit for you. Now you have the person who'll really check it and be really thorough. The person who actually is maybe they have 15 thoughts in a moment, but actually they're really creative because now they're going to come up with other ideas to solve this solution. So we want to think about it rather than thinking about, oh, I'll have to accommodate. Oh, it's going to take more time to talk to them. We actually want to completely flip the narrative and think they're the ones that are going to help to drive and push this team. And if we don't bring them in and put in pieces that support everybody, we're going to stagnate.
Let's talk about sports for a second. As a former ice hockey coach, I definitely had a team, and they thought in different ways. So maybe what is your take on neurodivergence in sports? What are some of the things that coaches need to be aware of? Is there stigma?
Absolutely. Coaches need to be aware that, look, there is still stigma. So I think if coaches can have that fundamental education in, the different neurodivergencies and how they can support people, no different to the manager. That's really impactful because in sports, you have to give instruction and you have to teach as well as inspire and motivate people. But particularly for sport, we rely on sport when we're doing something that involves movement or visual spatial skills. So, how you show it to somebody is going to be really important. How you model it. So, thinking that if I just use language, I've taken out this whole other visual spatial piece. So, how we actually instruct and model and think about how we demonstrate. Like high performance teams use video playback all the time. Again, that's another visual cognitive strategy. So we need to be thinking about these things when we're in sport, rather than thinking about how we give feedback. Feedback is asking good questions. What did that feel like? How did that work for you? What did you notice there when you were doing that? Also, we need to think about that sport will often attract people who are neurodivergent because it's maybe their special interest or it's how they self regulate. So, for many ADHDers or anybody with like that self regulation, you don't even have to have the diagnosis. They will be the person who's quite happy to get up at 4 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the morning. They will need 2 hours of exercise to regulate before they ever go into work or school and feel amazing for it. For some people, they will love their special interest and they will be incredible at anything from chess to ice hockey to basketball because they will repeat and practice. So I would say we need to approach sport with the lens of course, there's neurodivergency here, and knowing it and understanding it so that we can get the most out of our athletes.
And you had mentioned before we spoke that actually a lot of athletes actually do
Yeah.
identify
Yeah.
as ADHD, and I can see that as a coach. With hockey in particular, right? You're running a practice, you need people to follow A and B, and you want to keep them in line. But really the strength that there's energy to burn, that they need that cognitive burn, like you can really leverage it. So yeah, how do
Absolutely.
you find that magic of keeping order in practice but also pushing them to achieve, I think is a challenge that coaches face even more than employers, because I think
Yeah.
in the employer setting there's more opportunity for one-on-one, there's more opportunity for individual questions. When you're coaching a team, there's not always that opportunity to get to know each player, although I would encourage a good coach to get to know each player and how different they are. But I've seen coaches unintentionally, like good with good intention, partly just time, painting the same brush or the same expectations on the team. Yeah, do you have any thoughts on
Absolutely.
that, Áine?
If you can look at it as a sports coach of like that piece around self regulation and understanding the neuroscience of self regulation, that actually the first bit, like what you said, connection, even if you don't know everybody really well, but just connection with the team and with the individuals. Then thinking about, like when we think about as a coach, that piece around self-regulation, the cognitive, the emotional, the social. So from the cognitive perspective, as a coach, to be an effective coach, we come with our plan. What are we going to be focusing on tonight's session? So can you give them the quick overview at the start? Knowing that, you know what, if we have a lot of ADHDers, they may not listen to me, but that's okay because I'm cueing them, I'm bringing them in. Here's the plan, guys. This is what we're going to focus on. And then having, in a way, our structure to the training session or whatever, we're doing there, so that then they get to burn off that energy, they get to know it. And then how we explain the nuances of what we want as a group or in small groups. So I think if we can think of it more in that piece of self-regulation, you could probably do a whole, I think, podcast interview on sport on its own, Lindsay.
Well, I think you just signed yourself up for another one.
Because it is, as you said, you'll have many people who come to sport who are autistic, ADHD, ADHD, who are dyspraxic. People think that dyspraxic, because it's seen as a motor coordination condition, won't be into sport. Yes, they will. They will be amazing at basketball or at ice hockey. Get them to tie a tie or make their own sandwich in the canteen, and they might not be amazing.
Right.
But because they've had the best intervention of practicing and they've spent years practicing ice hockey, they will probably be very good at that because they've developed it in that set and those skills. But it hasn't, that's part of dyspraxia. It doesn't necessarily transfer over to everything else. So I do think it's a lot of, if we could do more education with sports leaders, that would be incredible.
Yes, 100%. So, Áine, if you were to give a piece of advice to new managers or new coaches, what advice would you give them to create an environment where they're driving everybody's performance?
Okay, come in with an open mindset and think about, how do I communicate this for everybody's brain to hear it? Not just my style of communication. So thinking about how I deliver my message, that it meets everybody's brain styles.
One of the things that I love are habits. Do you have a leadership habit that you never skip?
I actually do, but this doesn't come into the leadership arena in a formal way. It's funny actually you said this. I go to the gym every morning. And that is not for the people who work with me. So my husband is also my business partner. And really that protects both of us in business, because I'm dyslexic. I'm more than likely undiagnosed ADHD as well. Look, I know that I am, but I've just never gone down that route. And for me, going to the gym means that by the time I start work, I'm much more focused. I'm regulated. I don't send him 15 emails with rapid fire instructions and minimal detail. So that for me is my leadership habit.
Oh, and it
Slow
is a
myself
leadership
down.
habit. Oh, I would challenge you. It's probably one of the most important leadership habits that leaders can do. It is putting your own air mask on first, taking care of yourself.
Yeah.
It is the movement. Sometimes it can be meditative, the thoughts that come up, and doing it first. Áine, I think that it is probably one of the most powerful leadership habits.
What is?
What's one piece of advice that you received earlier in your career that still holds up?
Respect everybody. Always talk to everybody. Back in the day, a long time ago, when I worked in hospital settings, it was, be respectful to the cleaners, and it really did sit with me. I remember many consultants I worked with that, were the ones that you would aspire to, actually gave everybody the same respect when it came to engaging with people.
I love
Because
that.
everybody, that's what makes the ship sail. You
So
need everybody
true.
on your team.
I used to take, as part of an interview process, I used to take the candidate out for coffee or out for lunch. And I was more interested in how they interacted with the hostess or with the service staff than even in the conversation. So I think it's important.
Yeah.
It's reflective of how
Ah,
you treat everybody.
it is. That's the, we're talking about neurodiversity in the workplace. How do you treat people? Yeah.
What's one podcast, book, resource that has shaped the way you think about leadership?
This is actually an old one. It's not that new. So probably the work by Nancy Klein, Time to Think. I I remember when I read her book a long time ago. I think for me, no matter what area you work in, that piece of time to think, how we reflect as a leader, as a person, an individual in our own lives, that for me was a really, really powerful book that I read quite a long time ago. So, yeah.
And as a final question, Anya, what are you hoping that managers, leaders, coaches take out of our conversation today? If they were to do one thing.
I'd like them to take awareness and understanding and to show up empathically and curiously for the people that they meet in their professional lives.
And personal lives, right?
Yeah,
So
oh, absolutely. Because that's exactly it. It's like, yeah, we're all, working, but we're parents of neurodivergent children. We're brothers and sisters. We're friends. So it doesn't stop, at 5 or at 9. This is, yeah, personal and professional. So thank you.
thank you, Anya. I appreciate your time and your generosity. Thank you for
You're
being
so
here.
welcome.